Ahoy, mateys! Welcome to Podcasts of the Caribbean, a podcast covering the world of Pirates of the Caribbean, from the theme parks to the movies and everything in between. My name is Justin Helmer, and I will be your host on this voyage through the Caribbean. It'd be too late to alter course now, mateys. Welcome back to Podcasts of the Caribbean. This is episode 7. And we are still making our way through the second movie in the Pirates franchise, which is Dead Man's Chest. So, I hope you enjoyed the 90-minute long episode last week. I was not intending it to go that long. I kind of got carried away. So I don't know how long this one's going to be. We'll find out. But we left off last time right after Davy Jones gave Jack Sparrow 3 days to collect 99 more souls to join the Flying Dutchman's crew. So Jack has told Gibbs that they're now on their way to Tortuga to pick up these crewmen they need to find. So let's get right back into where we left off, and we're going right back over to the Edinburgh Trader, where Elizabeth is drafting a plan to get herself to Tortuga. So before we get back into the movie real quick, we do have another update on Pirates of the Caribbean future films from producer Jerry Bruckheimer. A new interview just came out the day before I recorded this episode. So I'm going to just go over the Pirates stuff in this interview. So it's time for our next part of Pirates News.
I hear a rumor.
You may have also heard whisperings and rumors.
A message from someone you know. I always listened like a thief for news of the Black Pearl.
So the interviewer asked Jerry if 3 questions about Pirates of the Caribbean, and we'll just go through them real quick. So the first question is, Pirates 6 has gone through so many iterations, why has it been tough to crack? And this is what Jerry Bruckheimer responded with. So Jerry said, "Oh God, they're all hard. I think we're getting very close on that one too. We have a very good script. We developed 2 of them, the one with Margot Robbie and one with a younger cast. The Margot Robbie one needs a little more work. The younger cast one is close. Hopefully we'll get both of them." So I'm interested in what this younger cast means. So of course a few weeks ago, Margot Robbie said that her Pirates movie wasn't happening anymore. But Jerry has stated since that it is still in the works. It's just not the one they're working on right now. There's 2 films and they're focusing on this one that Jerry says has a younger cast. So I'm interested in what Jerry means by younger cast. I was thinking maybe he's referring to maybe Henry and Karina, Henry Turner and Karina Barbosa from Pirates 5. But he hasn't stated what that really means, so we're kind of just left to think, does he mean characters from Pirates 5, or are we talking about completely new characters entering the franchise? I guess we'll have to wait to find out. But there was a second question the interviewer asked about the Margot Robbie Pirates movie, so let's get into that. So the interviewer said, but Margot Robbie said in an interview the project wasn't happening. And Jerry answered, "It's alive for me. It's alive for Disney. I'm sure she was disappointed it didn't go first, or maybe not because she's very busy. So it might be a blessing to push this a bit. We believe we'll get it made. It's a very strong story." So that's also interesting that Jerry believes that this Margot Robbie movie also has a strong story with it. So I'm interested in both of these movies. Of course, I'm interested in Pirates 6 more because I'm hoping that will continue the main story. But I'm just a sucker for pirates in general, so I'll take any pirate media you can throw at me. But there was also one more question about pirates. This one had to do with Johnny Depp. So the interviewer asked, does the recent trial outcome make Johnny Depp someone a studio like Disney would put front and center again in a Pirates sequel? So of course this is a very topical question here. If Disney would hire Johnny back after the trial that happened earlier this year. So Jerry then answered, "You'd have to ask them. I can't answer that question. I really don't know. I would love to have him in the movie. He's a friend, a terrific actor, and it's unfortunate that personal lives creep into everything we do." And that is Jerry's statement on Johnny coming back. So, of course, Johnny said that he didn't want to come back. It's a very famous statement that, they could pay me millions of dollars and millions of alpacas, and he still wouldn't come back. But it's still up in the air. We don't know if he would ever come back, if Disney could repair the relationship. Because, of course, if you do remember, Johnny Depp was made a Disney legend years ago for his contribution in Disney, not just as Jack Sparrow, but his other roles as well. So it would be unfortunate to let that relationship just disappear entirely. I'm hoping they could patch things up. I would love to see Jack Sparrow again, but as I said, Jack Sparrow was never really meant to be the main character in Pirates of the Caribbean. He just kind of ended up being the most famous character, and therefore kind of became the main character, but it was never the intention, really. So that is our Pirates update for this episode. Some nice bits to think about, especially with the younger cast. What does that really mean? I guess we'll have to wait and see, but that's our Pirates update from Jerry Bruckheimer. Now let's get right back into our recap of Dead Man's Chest. So as I said, we're going right back over to the Edinburgh Trader, and we have this scene of Captain Bellamy, talking to some of his crew members in the captain's cabin. So he is outraged that the East India Trading Company has pretty much taken over the trade on the Caribbean. So we see this shot of some papers on his desk here, all with the East India Trading Company logo embellished on them. And this one in front of the screen here says Captain Bellamy, Edinburgh Trader, Port Tariff. And it has all the different tariffs and taxes from the different ports that they're trading from. So Bellamy, of course, he says, it's an outrage. Port tariffs, berthing fees, wharf handling, and heaven help us, pilotage. Are we all to work for the East India Trading Company then? So he's outraged, but his crew member then says, I'm afraid, sir, Tortuga is the only free port left in these waters. Then Bellamy responds, a pirate port is what you mean. And he's like, well, I'm sorry. An honest sailor is what I am, and I make my living fair, and I sleep well each night for it. And as soon as he says that, the two crew members in the cabin with him, they see something float by the windows outside, and they all get creeped out. And they look out the window, and they see Elizabeth's wedding dress flying past the window, and they all get scared. So they all go on deck, and they see the dress floating in midair. And now, of course, it's not really floating, but the dress points to Bellamy, and then we have a shot of Elizabeth up on the mast, controlling the dress with some strings. This is a very clever plan from Elizabeth. Of course, this is going off of what the sailors were thinking earlier in the movie. They thought it was, a possessed spirit that was looking for her husband lost at sea. So she played on that and kind of made this to really get her to where she wants to go and kind of take advantage of all these guys. So she makes the dress point over from Bellamy to the sea, and then one of the crewmen's like, she wants you to do something. And then Bellamy says, she's trying to give a sign. And then the dress flies off deck, and they look for it, and then it flies back over them, and it knocks a lantern onto the deck and starts lighting some stuff on fire. Now you can see as they run over to the other side where the dress went, you can see the fire is starting to make a letter. It's making a letter T. So Elizabeth has placed some gunpowder on deck in, of course, the word Tortuga. Not to spoil anything, but she gets frustrated because these guys are not catching on to her plan here. So they're looking at the other side, and they're trying to see what the sign is. And the one guy is like, there's the sign. And then another guy is like, that's seaweed. And he's like, seaweed can be a sign. And then the other guy's like, looks like entrails. And Elizabeth, she gets down from the mast, and then she says in her manly voice, what's that over there? And they all turn around, and then they see the burning word spelling out Tortuga on deck. And then we cut right over to Tortuga. We're back. So, of course, the last time we were on Tortuga was, of course, earlier in the movie with Will asking about Jack. But we weren't really here for a decent scene since the first film. So it's great to return here. Looks like nothing's changed. We do have some Easter eggs referencing the ride. So as it goes through this pan shot, you can see that there is a guy being dunked and pulled out of a well, and he's also spitting some water. That is a direct reference to the mayor being dunked in the well from the Pirates of the Caribbean ride at Disneyland. So it's cool to have that in there. And then we go right over to the Faithful Bride Tavern, which is our main place for Tortuga in this movie. And we go right over to Gibbs, who is he's hosting a signing for crew members to join the Black Pearl's crew, of course, to then send these guys over to Davy Jones for Jack's debt. So we have a few different crew members here that I'll highlight. So Gibbs asks the first guy, and what makes you think you're worthy to crew the Black Pearl? And this guy is a very old guy. He's got a walking stick. And this guy says, I'd never sailed a day in my life. I figured I'd get out and see the world while I'm still young. And then Gibbs is like, you'll do. Make your mark. So, of course, Jack and Gibbs, they don't really care who they get. They just need to get 99 people, which is a lot of people. So they're hiring everybody. They don't care because they're going to be sold off to Davy Jones, unfortunately. So Gibbs then calls up the next guy, who is a drunk pirate, and he says this funny line. I still laugh to this day. So this guy says, my wife has run off with my dog, and I'm drunk for a month, and I don't give an ass rat if I live or die. And then Gibbs just says, perfect, next. So I love that guy. He's just, oh my God, I love it. It's fantastic. So the next guy we have up is, we have a shot before we get to the next guy. Jack is saying, I know what I want, I know what I want, I know what I want. And he's shaking the compass. He's trying to get it to work. Because if you remember, Jack's compass is still circling and it's not pointing to anywhere. So then we go back over to the crew signing, and we have our next pirate here, and he says, me have one arm and a bum leg. And then Gibbs then says, it's the crow's nest for you. And then we have our last crew member here, where he says, I've always wanted to sail the seas, forever. And then Gibbs says, sooner than you think, sign the roster. And then the guy says, thanks very much. So this great scene, bringing these guys in. And then we have our next guy who comes up. But before that, Jack asks Gibbs, how we're going so far. And then Gibbs says, including those 4, that gives us 4. And once Gibbs answers here, our next guy comes up, and then Gibbs says, and what's your story? And then this guy says, my story. It's exactly the same as your story, just one chapter behind. And then you can see Gibbs' face changes in this scene, where he kind of starts to his eyes narrow and he gets a little scared. And then also Jack gets alarmed here because this guy says, I chased a man across the 7 seas. Then we have a shot of Jack freezing and looking over. And then this guy continues and he says, the pursuit cost me my crew, my commission, and my life. And then he grabs the bottle of rum off the table, and then we see this is none other than James Norrington, of course, played by Jack Davenport. He's back, finally. So Gibbs is like, Commodore? And then James lashes out and is like, no, not anymore. Weren't you listening? And then Norrington gets close to Gibbs and he says, I nearly had you all off Tripoli. I would have, if it weren't for that hurricane. And then Gibbs gets scared and is like, Lord, you didn't try to sail through it. So, of course, this goes back to the hurricane that I explained back in the first episode for Dead Man's Chest, back in episode 5. So if you haven't listened to that, of course, make sure you go back and listen. But I'll recap it here very quickly because it ties into Norrington's story. So, of course, as I said last time, the hurricane was this hurricane off the coast of Tripoli. Norrington was pursuing Jack after Curse of the Black Pearl. And Jack, since he had the Black Pearl, which was the fastest ship, he knew that he would be able to get through this hurricane no problem. But he was not expecting Norrington to sail into it. But Norrington wanted to catch Jack, and Norrington foolishly sailed into it on the Dauntless. Now, once he did this, he didn't make it out. The Dauntless was destroyed. Most of his crew was lost in this hurricane, and he barely survived this. Of course, once he made it back to Port Royal, he resigned from the Navy, and then he disappeared. So you can see here, he still has his wig. He's still wearing his Commodore outfit. So he's pretty much just been a bum for a decent amount of time now, which kind of makes me sad. But it's a great addition to James Norrington's character and his story. And I've noticed that when you watch a lot of deleted scenes, there's a lot of deleted scenes that involve Norrington in all 3 movies that he's in. Which makes me sad because they really cut out a lot of cool elements to James Norrington's character. I'll probably do episodes on all the deleted scenes for these movies because there's a bunch for the first 3 movies. There's like 20 deleted scenes for Dead Man's Chest alone, which is a lot. So one day, maybe we'll get extended editions of Pirates 1, 2, and 3. That's my hope. Hopefully it'll happen. But yeah, anyway, that's a recap of the hurricane with Norrington. So he then says, "So do I make your crew or not?" And then gives his kind of question, and he's like, and then Norrington says, "You haven't said where you're going." "Somewhere nice." And then he flips the table and knocks Gibbs over. And then he shouts and he's like, "So am I worthy to serve under Captain Jack Sparrow?" And then we can see Jack trying to hide himself behind a plant as he's trying to get away. And Norrington pulls out a pistol and aims it at Jack. And then he just says, "Or should I just kill you now?" And then Jack looks at him and he says, "You're hired." And then Norrington's like, "Sorry, old habits and all that." And then he's ready to fire, but the 4 crew members that Jack just hired grab Norrington and move his gun up to the ceiling. And they're like, "Easy, sailor, that's our captain you're threatening." And then he shoots his pistol, and the round ricochets off the chandelier and destroys one of the pirates' rum bottles. And this then starts the bar fight. So everyone just starts fighting, pirates against pirates, and they're all just getting destroyed. Norrington's taking some out. Random pirates are fighting each other, and Jack sees this opportunity and like, yeah, let's get out of here. So he says, "Time to go," and Gibbs agrees, and they try to make a run for it. So this scene was very well choreographed. As you can see, there's a lot of stuff going on. And they were able to really do this stuff in very few takes because it was so well rehearsed. There's a whole actual deleted scene about the Tortuga brawl and how they filmed it. And I'll go over that maybe in a different episode. But it's really cool how they had this down so well, they didn't have to do too many takes. Because there's a big reset time for a scene like this, with so much stuff happening, so many things getting destroyed. You know, once you do a take, it would probably be like maybe 30 minutes, an hour to get everything back to where it was to do another take. So of course you really wanted to make sure that you were giving your best, so you wouldn't have to do this that many times and you could save a lot of time on production. So as this bar fight breaks out, we see Elizabeth makes her way into the Faithful Bride, and she sees Norrington. So she then, of course, sees the fight happening, and she pulls out her sword and starts fighting off pirates as well. So now we have Norrington and Elizabeth engaged in that sword fight, and Jack and Gibbs are making their way up the staircase, and he's kind of just picking up random hats and trying them on. Of course, if you remember, he lost his hat in the water at the beginning of the movie. So he tries on a first hat here, and it looks very similar to his regular hat, but he doesn't like it. He takes off and puts it on another pirate as they fall down, and he grabs another hat while he does this. And we have some great choreography from Keira Knightley and Jack Davenport in this scene. As I said, this was so well rehearsed. And there's a great interview. Of course, I mentioned last time there was a Mastering the Sword Orlando Bloom featurette for Dead Man's Chest. There was also one for Jack Davenport, also one for Keira Knightley. And in the one for Keira, they were talking about how, if her acting career didn't work out, she could become a stunt woman because she was so good. So everyone was praising Keira on how well she was doing, because she would really get things down quick and they wouldn't have to really redo them, which is fantastic. So Jack makes his way up the staircase here, and he sees another pirate just sitting on a ledge, and he switches hats, and then he says, "Thanks, mate," and the guy falls off the railing, falls down to the floor, which I love. And then we have another shot of some pirates hoisting another guy. They're about to throw him off the ledge, and Jack stops him. He puts the hat on the guy's head, and then he gets out of the way and says, "Carry on," and they throw the guy off the ledge. And then Jack and Gibbs leave the Faithful Bride, and we finally have our fight come to a standstill. And Norrington says, "Come on then, who wants some? Form an orderly line, I'll have you one by one. Come on, who's first?" And then Elizabeth has had enough of this. She grabs the bottle out of Norrington's hand and smashes it on his head and knocks him out. And this stuns literally everybody. And then Elizabeth then just says, "I just wanted the pleasure of doing that myself." And then they all cheer. They put their weapons away. And then our next shot is these pirates throwing Norrington into the pig pen outside. And they all start laughing and they walk away. But Elizabeth is the only one that remains, and she goes over to him. But as the pirates are leaving, we see a shot of Ian Mercer lurking around the corner watching Elizabeth and Norrington. So, of course, he is now aware, and he is going to tell Beckett that he has found Elizabeth on Tortuga. But Elizabeth approaches Norrington here, and she picks him up, and he sees her again for the first time, and then she says to him, "James Norrington, what has the world done to you?" And then we go right over to the Flying Dutchman, and we have our fantastic Davy Jones score. The fantastic Davy Jones theme composed by Hans Zimmer, with the organ and everything. It's stellar. One of the best pieces of music for a movie. You cannot argue with that. It's so fantastic. And then you have the emotion with the locket as well. We see it here in this scene. Of course, we saw Tiadama had one just like that earlier in the movie, so that's a connection that we can start making. But this is just fantastic, and the acting from Bill Nighy, he of course couldn't play a piano with his tentacles in real life, so he was just on that piano making those facial movements along the organ. I think I said piano, sorry, organ. And of course, in post-production, they took his facial reactions and morphed that into Davy Jones with the tentacles playing the organ. So I just think it's absolutely fantastic acting from Bill Nighy. Not everyone can do this. You think, oh yeah, just to be on set, just do the moves, and then they can make the character later. No, I feel like the biggest part of Davy Jones's character is Bill Nighy's performance, because his face and the way he moves and the way he talks, that is Davy Jones. Like, you can literally see Bill Nighy in that suit, in that motion capture suit, and you will say, oh, that's Davy Jones. You can still be frightened of him, even though he's wearing a gray suit with, white balls all over it. You'll still be scared of him because that is Davy Jones, the voice and the actions and the movements. It's only enhanced with the actual digital effects later on. So we have Davy Jones doing this very emotional performance. You can see in his face Of course, again, Bill Nye, absolute stellar acting. Then we cut over to the deck of the Flying Dutchman, where the crew are performing their duties, and they're hoisting a cannon above deck. And we see Will here as well, helping them out. And they're shouting heave. And then we have these great shots of all our different Dutchman crew members. And then we see the bosun here, and he shouts, "Secure the mast tackle, Mr. Turner." And of course, Bootstrap and Will both hear Mr. Turner. And since Will doesn't know that Bootstrap, his father, is on the ship, he thinks that the bosun is talking to him. But also, Bootstrap doesn't know that Will is on the Dutchman, so he thinks the bosun is talking to him. So they both go up to secure the mast tackle, and they both get to it, and they're both fighting each other off. And so they're like, "Step aside, hey, mind yourself." And then Bootstrap's like, "Let go, boy." And then he sees Will's face, and then Bootstrap freezes, and he says no. And then he drops the rope, and the cannon comes crashing down onto the deck. But he forgot that Will was holding on to it, so it pulls, as it flies out, it pulls Will with it. And the cannon slams into the deck, knocks everyone over, and the bosun comes up on deck, and he sees Will with the rope in his hands, so he says, "Haul that weevil to his feet." So they grab Will because they think Will was responsible, and they put him on the rigging, and then the bosun says, "5 lashes will remind you to stay on him." And then, but right before he's about to use his whip, Bootstrap stops him, and then the bosun says, "Impeding me in my duties. You'll share the punishment." And then Bootstrap says, "I'll take it all." And as soon as he says this, we see Davy Jones emerge, and he says, "Will you now?" Then he steps up, and he says, "And what would prompt such an act of charity?" So after he says this, Bootstrap then responds, and he says, "My son." And then Jones is a little confused, and he tilts his head, but Bootstrap turns around, and he says, "He's my son." And then Will turns around and looks at him and realizes that it's his father. So Davy Jones then steps forward a little bit, and then he starts laughing. So he's like, "Ah ha ha, what fortuitous circumstance be this? 5 lashes be owed, I believe it is." And then he grabs the whip from the bosun and gives it to Bootstrap. So Bootstrap is scared to death here, and he says, "No, I won't." And then Jones replies, and he says, "The cat's out of the bag, Mr. Turner. Your issue will feel its sting by the bosun's hand, or your own." So Bootstrap is not sure what to do here. It's either him or the bosun. But since Bootstrap believes he will hopefully be more merciful to Will, he still says no. But Jones is then ready to make his decision, and he yells, "Bosun!" And as soon as he says that, Bootstrap grabs the whip and says no. And then Bootstrap is now about to give the punishment to his son. So, of course, this is a very hard scene to watch. It's also a very fantastic scene of character development and story progression. But we can see Bootstrap giving Will the first lash, and Will's reaction here. And it's very hard to see because it's raining, but after the second lash, we have a shot of Bootstrap's face, and you can see a tear rolling down from his eye. And it's really hard to see because it's raining in this scene, but if you pay attention, you can see it, and it breaks my heart every time, because, you know, this is the last thing Bootstrap would ever want to do, is hurt his son like this. But of course, he does the last 3 lashes for a total of 5. And of course, Jones is relishing in this experience here. But after that's over, they throw Will down onto the deck, and we can see his absolutely destroyed and bloodied back, which is absolutely terrible. But the crew says, "You had it easy, boy." And then they walk away, and then Bootstrap comes up and he says, "Will." And then Will shakes him off and he says, "I don't need your help." And then Bootstrap says, "The bosun prides himself on cleaving flesh from bone with every swing." And then Will says, so I'm to understand what you did was an act of compassion." And then Bootstrap just replies, "Yes." And then we go into our next scene here, which is a fantastic scene as well, where Bootstrap explains to Will about the Dutchman and, the service that he has. So Bootstrap says, 100 years before the mast, losing who you were bit by bit, until you end up like poor Wyvern here. And then he points to this guy, Wyvern, who is a part of the ship. He is completely a part of the hull of the Flying Dutchman, which is absolutely crazy. But you can see he's holding a lantern, and he's just stuck to it, completely, not even a person anymore. Which also gives me a very strange feeling that how many other people are literally bound into the hull of the Flying Dutchman. It's a very scary thing to think about. But they see Wyvern, and Will looks at him, and he's, very creeped out. But Bootstrap then says, "Once you've sworn an oath to the Dutchman, there's no leaving it." And then Will says, "I've sworn no oath." And Bootstrap then, says, "Then you must get away." But then Will says, "Not until I find this." And he shows Bootstrap the drawing of the key. And Will says, "The key." And as soon as he says that, Wyvern wakes up and he opens his eyes and he gasps and he breaks off the wall here. You can see his brain protruding and everything. And then Wyvern just says, "The dead man's chest." And then Will's like, "What do you know of this?" And then Wyvern then says, "Open the chest with the key and stab the heart." No. Don't stab the heart. The Dutchman needs a living heart, or there'll be no captain. And if there's no captain, then there's no one to have the key. And then Will, of course, takes from this, so the captain has the key. And then Wyvern gets scared and he kind of goes back into the hull. But before he does, Will says, "Where's the key?" And Wyvern says, "Hidden." And then Will says, "Where's the chest?" And then Wyvern says, "Hidden." And then he closes his eyes and binds himself to the ship again. Then we go back over to Tortuga, where the Black Pearl is getting ready to make way. And Jack and Gibbs are stopped by Elizabeth. So she shouts, "Captain Sparrow." Then he turns around and he says, "Come to join my crew, lad? Welcome aboard." And then she says, "I'm here to find the man I love." And then Jack is stopped in his tracks and he's looking all awkward. And he's like, "I'm deeply flattered, son, but my first and only love is to sea." And he makes this motion at Gibbs. And we see Norrington here. He's just puking over the side from the mud. And then Elizabeth then says, "Meeting William Turner, Captain Sparrow." And then we have this shot of a shocked and flabbergasted Gibbs and Jack when they both turn around and Jack's like, "Elizabeth." And then Jack just turns around to Gibbs and says, "Hide the rum." And then Gibbs just has the rum bottle in his hand and he just awkwardly runs up the gangplank onto the Pearl. And then Jack then says, "These clothes do not flatter you at all. It should be a dress or nothing. I happen to have no dress in my cabin." Elizabeth then says, "Jack, I know Will came to find you. Where is he?" And then Jack has this great line where he's like, "Darling, I am truly unhappy to have to tell you this, but through an unfortunate series of circumstances that has nothing to do with me, poor Will has been press-ganged into Davy Jones's crew." I love how he uses the word press-ganged. But Elizabeth is like, "Davy Jones?" And then Norrington's like, "Oh, please. The captain of the Flying Dutchman." And then Jack's like, "You look bloody awful. What are you doing here?" And then Norrington's like, "You hired me. I can't help it if your standards are lax." And then Jack's like, "You smell funny." And then Elizabeth chimes in and she's like, "Jack, all I want is to find Will." And then Jack hears this, and then he realizes that she could use the compass. So he offers, "Are you certain? Is that what you really want most?" And then Elizabeth, says, "Of course." And then Jack says, "Because I would think you would want to find a way to save Will most." And then Elizabeth then says, "And you have a way of doing that." And Jack says, "Well, there is a chest." And then Norrington from the back is like, "Oh dear." And Jack continues and he's like, "A chest of unknown size and origin." And in this moment we have Pintel and Righetti lugging some cargo onto the ship. And Pintel chimes in, he's like, "With what contains the still beating heart of Davy Jones." And then Righetti does this funny motion where he grabs the heart from his chest and does the beating in his hands. So she, of course, is confused about them being there, but Jack continues before she can say anything. And he's like, "And whoever possesses that chest possesses the leverage to command Jones to do whatever it is he or she wants, including saving brave William from his grim fate." And then Norrington's like, "You don't actually believe him, do you?" So Elizabeth ponders this for a second. And then she buys into Jack's story, and she's like, "Where do we find it?" And then Norrington's like, "What?" And he just like, but Jack's like, "With this." And he pulls out his compass. And he's like, "My compass. It is unique." And then Norrington chimes in and like, "Unique having the meaning of broken." And it's this moment where Norrington just begins to walk away. But Jack continues and he says, "True enough, this compass does not point north." And then Elizabeth asks, "Well, where does it point?" And Jack then finally reveals, "It points to the thing you want most in this world." So, of course, this is finally the reveal of what Jack's compass leads to. We never got it in the first film, and we've been kind of confused as to why it's been broken this whole movie so far. But this is the full reveal of what the compass actually does. So Elizabeth then asks Jack, "Are you telling the truth?" And then Jack says, "Every word, love." "And what you want most in this world is to find the chest of Davy Jones, is it not?" And then Elizabeth says, "To save Will." And then Jack says, "By finding the chest of Davy Jones." And then he opens the compass and runs away. And thankfully, the compass actually stops and points to something for Elizabeth. So then Jack sees this. He pops up from the bottom of the screen here. I love this shot. And he's like, "Mr. Gibbs." And then Gibbs is like, "Captain." And Jack says, "We have our heading." And Gibbs is like, "Finally." And if any of you people listening to this grew up in the early 2000s with the Disney DVDs, the Disney DVD intro with all the different movies, and it starts with Jack saying, "We have our heading." And of course, fantastic, iconic advertisement. If you grew up watching those Disney DVDs, you know what I'm talking about. Absolute banger of an advertisement. But every time I hear that line, that ad pops in my head. So thank you, Disney, for a fantastic ad that unfortunately it's no longer in use because Blu-rays are now a thing, and there is no version for the Disney Blu-ray, unfortunately. But Gibbs then says, "Cast off those lines, weigh anchor, and crowd that canvas." And then he goes back up the gangplank. And then Jack then says, Miss Swann. And then we can see in the background of the shot the crew members that Jack and Gibbs hired earlier are also coming aboard. So Elizabeth follows Jack on board, and then Pintel and Rigetti drop a goat into Norrington's arms, and he's like, welcome to the crew, former Commodore. And then we go right back over to Port Royal, which of course we haven't been here in a little bit. But we have a absolutely fantastic little scene here with Cutler Beckett and Weatherby Swann. This is a very, very important scene. It is the last time we see Governor Swann in this movie. But this is a fantastic scene, and we have a lot of cool stuff to talk about. So we see Beckett first, and he says, there's something to knowing the exact shape of the world and one's place in it. And we see in this shot, Beckett is holding a certain sword. Now, this is actually the exact sword from the first movie. This is the sword that Will Turner made in the first movie that was given to Norrington when he was promoted to Commodore. So, of course, after Norrington resigned, he gave this sword back. So Beckett has this sword, and it's fantastic to see it again in this movie. But remember this, keep your eyes peeled for this sword. It will appear again. So make sure to keep your eyes peeled for this sword. It's a very, very important sword. I like to call it the Sword of Destiny. So we'll see it again soon, so keep your eyes peeled. But we then cut over to Weatherby Swann, who is in shackles. Of course, he was caught by Mercer earlier in the film. And he says, I assure you, these are not necessary, meaning his chains. And then Beckett then says, I thought you'd be interested in the whereabouts of your daughter. And then Weatherby Swann asks, you have news of her? And then Ian Mercer chimes in, and he's like, most recently seen on Tortuga, then left in the company of a known pirate, Jack Sparrow, and other fugitives from justice. And then Governor Swann's shaking his head, and he's like, justice? Hardly. And then Beckett says, including the previous owner of this sword, I believe. And then as he says that, Governor Swann is, he doesn't, of course he understands that that was the sword Norrington had, so he's like, oh, like Elizabeth found Norrington, that's good. Norrington will protect her. But Beckett then says, our ships are in pursuit. Justice will be dispensed by cannonade and cutlass and all manner of remorseless pieces of metal. I find it distasteful to even contemplate the horrors awaiting everyone on board. And he turns back to Weatherby Swann, and he says, what do you want from me? And then Beckett says, your authority as governor, your influence in London, and your loyalty to the East India Trading Company. And then Weatherby Swann says, to you, you mean? And Beckett walks closer to him, and he says, shall I remove these shackles? And then Weatherby Swann thinks about this for a second. And he then finally replies, do what you can for my daughter. And Mercer then unlocks the shackles from his hands. And then we have one of my favorite lines in Pirates of the Caribbean history. One of my favorite lines from Cutler Beckett, where he says this. So you see, Mercer, every man has a price he will willingly accept, even for what he hoped never to sell. And then we have one final shot of Governor Swann looking back up at the camera before we cut away back to the Flying Dutchman. So that scene, I feel like, is such a great scene for Weatherby Swann's character, for Beckett's character. Of course, we have the sword coming back, the Sword of Destiny, as I call it, coming back. But that final line from Beckett is one of the best lines of this entire franchise. Every man has a price he will willingly accept, even for what he hopes never to sell. So, of course, this references, at this point in the movie, Governor Swann is no longer Governor Swann. He has been arrested. He's no longer governor. Cutler Beckett has pretty much taken over Port Royal and is kind of the ruler of Port Royal at this point. So, of course, Governor Swann, or at this point I should just say Weatherby Swann, he's no longer governor. He gave away his authority in London, his rank as governor, and he's now pledging his loyalty to the East India Trading Company, which is something he never wanted to do. But he's giving all this up for Elizabeth. Elizabeth is all that matters to him, and we'll see this later in the next movie, I should say. But Elizabeth is all that matters to him. All he thinks about from this point on is the safety of Elizabeth, which is rightly so. I mean, he is her father, and, that is what parents do. They worry about their kids. But when Beckett says, every man has a price he will willingly accept, even for what he hopes never to sell. And I just love that line. I love the meaning of that scene. It's fantastic. Oh my God. Anyway, let's move back over to the Flying Dutchman for the next scene, which is another iconic scene, and this is the Liar's Dice sequence. Now, in the movie, we have a short segment of Liar's Dice. It's about 2 minutes long, but there is a deleted scene that has an extended version of Liar's Dice with an extra 4 minutes of Liar's Dice. It's a full first game before this game we see in the movie. The game we see in the movie is the second game that they play. There is a first game that is shown in the deleted scene. With the deleted scene and with the part in the movie, it comes to about 7 or 8 minutes of footage for this entire sequence, which is great. I wish they had that part in the movie. It has a lot of really good plot development for Will. It has plot development for Davy Jones, for Bootstrap Bill. Absolutely great. I'll reference a little bit of it here once we get to the setting up of the game. But I'll cover it in full in a different episode when we go over deleted scenes. So we have this great close-up shot of the dice falling on the board. I love that shot, and I love the sound of the dice hitting the board. But we see Macus, Klenico, and Clankers. They are playing a game of Liar's Dice. And Macus, he says, I wager 10 years. And then Klenico says, I'll match 10 years. And then Clanker then says, agreed. So they are playing their game of Liar's Dice. And then Bootstrap comes up to Will and he asks, wondering how it's played. And then Will says, I understand. And then we see a shot of, Mac is being called a liar and everything. But Will says, it's a game of deception. But your bet includes all the dice, not just your own. And then Will asks, what are they wagering? And Bootstrap then says, well, the only thing we have left. Years of service. So then Will, he has his idea and he's like, any crew member can be challenged? And then Bootstrap says, anyone. And then we have this great delivery of this line from Orlando Bloom, and he says, I challenge Davy Jones. And then everyone freezes. Macus, Klenico, and Clanker freeze from their game. The whole crew watching them freezes, and they all look over at Will. And then Bootstrap's about to say something, but the organ music from above deck stops. And then they start hearing footsteps above them. I love the eeriness of this scene, the foreboding of Davy Jones coming down. But of course, when they hear his footsteps, you can see all the sea creatures from the deck shrink up at every footstep, and then everyone starts laughing. But we finally see Davy Jones come down, and then he says, I accept. So then we have the board being created, and Will and Davy Jones sitting down. And this is where we have the cut from the first game to the second game. So what we're seeing from now on is the second game of Liar's Dice. The first game happens right before this scene. So right after the board is placed and Jones walks up, there's that whole first scene. And then when Will stands up here, this is the second game. So I'll recap it a little bit just so I can get some more of this scene into this. So Will bets his father's freedom against his own, and Davy Jones, he says, "I bet only what's closest to a man's heart." He says that's the only way you can tell they're bluffing. And in this first game that they play, it's only Will and Davy Jones. Bootstrap's not in the first game, and this has a lot of great development. I won't cover all the bets and everything. That'll be for a later episode, but Davy Jones, he says, "You're a desperate man. What is the cause? It can only be a woman." And then, Will says, "A woman need not cause you to be desperate if you choose the right woman." And then Davy Jones says the next turn, he's like, "I remember now, you're the one who hopes to get married, but your fate is to be married to this ship." And then Will says, "I choose my own fate." And then Davy Jones says, "Well, then it wouldn't be fate then, would it?" So they play the game, and Davy Jones calls Will a liar after one of Will's bids. But Will then shows his dice, and Will wins this first game. Will actually wins this first game in the deleted scene. And then, Bootstrap comes up to Davy Jones and he says, "I'm free, Jones." And then Davy Jones walks away, and then we have Will stand up and he says, "Another game." And then we have this great exchange from Jones and Will, and Jones says, "You can't best the devil twice, son." And then Will just says, "Then why are you walking away?" And I love that line. And Jones turns around again and comes back. And now we are caught up with the movie in the second game of Liar's Dice that they play. So Jones comes back up and he says, "The stakes," and he says, "my soul, an eternity of servitude." But after that, Davy Jones then says, "Against," and then Will says, "I want this." And he drops the cloth on the board, and Jones picks it up and looks at it and sees the drawing of the key. So we have that great chime, the dead man's chest kind of chime. I love that sound. But Jones gets angry, he drops the cloth, and he says, "How do you know of the key?" And then Will says, "That's not part of the game, is it?" And he says, "You can still walk away," as he sits down. But of course, Jones is not backing down, and Jones does this fantastic, graceful sit where he just lowers his body down. And he pulls out the key from under his tentacle beard and shows Will. So now Will knows the location of the key, which is all he wants from this game, is to know where the key is. Will does not intend on winning. Of course, from the deleted scene, he's already won the first game. There's no way Jones is going to let him win again, especially with him wanting the key. So Will and Jones are about to do their first turn, but Bootstrap sits down and joins the game, and he places himself right between Jones and Will. So he is right in the middle, which means, according to the rules of Liar's Dice, which I'm pretty sure, there's a few different ways this game is played. There's actually, full rules of how this game is played in real life. There's also a few different rules for how the game is played in the movie. But what we see from the movie is that only the previous player can call that player a liar. So with Bootstrap being in the middle of Davy Jones and Will, Davy Jones cannot call Will a liar because Bootstrap is right in the middle. So Bootstrap is effectively saving Will from losing this game. So no matter what happens, Bootstrap is going to be the one to lose this game, and spoilers, he does lose the game. So Jones is angered from this, and he's like, "What's this?" And then Bootstrap says, "I'm in," matching his wager. And then Will says, "Don't do this." And then Bootstrap then just says, "The die is cast." And then he says, "I bid 3 2s. It's your bid, Captain." So of course we have our first bid from Bootstrap, which is 3 2s. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on in this game, and honestly, I mean, I've never played Liar's Dice in my life, so I'm just kind of basing my knowledge off of this scene. But it's a very strategic game where you really have to think about everyone's dice. So you're not just thinking about your own dice, you're thinking about everyone's dice. So with 3 people in here, there's 5 dice per person, it's 15 dice on the board. So Bootstrap is going with a safe bet here and saying that there's going to be 3 2s on the board, which is a very safe bet because we find out that he actually has 3 2s. So Jones then does his bid where he says 4 4s. So he ups the bid and changes the face, which is something you can do. And then we go over to Will, and Will makes his bet, which is 4 5s. So he goes up to another face. He keeps the amount, but he changes the face. And then we go to Bootstrap's next bid, and he says 6 3s. And Jones pretty much completely ignores Bootstrap's bid. And he goes right up and says, and he takes a look at his dice, and we see that Davy Jones has 4 5s and 1 4. So Jones makes his fantastic bet of 7 5s. So he knows he has 4 5s, and he is just hoping that Will has 3 5s, and we see a reveal of Will's dice here, and he has 3 5s, and 1 2 and 1 1. And then we also get the reveal of Bootstrap's dice, which is 3 2s and 2 3s. So there are actually 7 5s on the board, so Davy Jones is right, because he knows that Bootstrap didn't up the bid, he changed it to a completely different thing. He did 6 3s. So he knows that Bootstrap isn't going to have any 5s. So he knows Will has the 5s because Will did the first bid of 4 5s. So he knows that Will has a decent amount of 5s that he would bid 4 5s. So that's why he does this bid of 7 5s and pretty much dooms Will to lose the game. So Will really does the only thing he can do, and he just ups the bid even more, and he just says 8 5s. And of course, at this point, Will knows he's going to lose. And we have this shot that goes back over to Jones, and he laughs. And he's like, "Welcome to the crew, lad." And then right before we go to the next turn, Bootstrap, well, as soon as we go over to the next turn, Bootstrap says 12 5s. And then this shocks everyone. But this is actually a pretty logical bid, because it's actually less than the amount of dice on the board. It seems like it's a lot because he says 12 5s, but there's 15 dice on the board. Technically, you could get 12 5s. It's a very low chance of it happening, but you could get 12 5s. So it's not like a very outlandish bid like, 17 5s, and then, there's only 15 dice. But there are 15 dice, and he bids 12 5s. So it does work in theory, but he just wants to take the heat off of Will. So Jones gets very pissed from this, and Bootstrap says, "Call me a liar or up the bid." And then Jones says, "And be called a liar myself for my trouble." And he grabs the cup off of Bootstrap's dice, and he sees his dice, and he slams the cup down on the board. And then Jones then says, "Bootstrap Bill, you're a liar, and you will spend an eternity on this ship." Then he goes to leave, and before he does, he says, "Master Turner," and then he says, "Feel free to go ashore. The better next time we make port." And then the whole crew starts laughing, and Jones walks away. So as they all retreat, we're left with Will and Bootstrap, and Will says, "Fool, why did you do that?" And then Bootstrap said, "I couldn't let you lose." And then Will tells him it was never about winning or losing. And then Bootstrap realizes, and he says, "The key, you just wanted to know where it was." So then we go over to a little later that night. We see Clanker and Hadris sleeping together here. Hadris, of course, is the guy with the clamshell head. But then we see Bootstrap pop out from below decks, and we see Will follow him up. And Bootstrap goes up to the helm, because at this point everyone's asleep. So this is the perfect time to steal the key from Davy Jones. So Bootstrap goes up and he sees Greenbeard. I believe it's Greenbeard. It's hard to tell. There's so many guys on this ship. But Bootstrap says, "Captain says I should relieve you." And then Greenbeard's confused, but Bootstrap says, "Captain's orders." So Greenbeard then goes away, which leaves no one on deck but Bootstrap and Will, so it's the perfect opportunity to steal this key and get away. So Will enters Jones's cabin, where we see the fantastic Oregon, this great, awesome captain's cabin on this ship, and he just sees Davy Jones sitting there at the organ, but he is actually asleep. So Will sees he's asleep, and he's like, "This is my time to make my move." So he takes the quill and a little stick from the side of the organ and starts to pick up Jones's tentacles. So he goes very slowly because Jones kind of snorts and wakes up for a second and then goes back to sleep. But Will pulls up the front two tentacles and sees the key hanging in the back. So he puts the stick in his mouth to hold up that tentacle, and he tries to grab the key with his other hand, but the tentacle on the quill drops and hits a key on the organ, and Jones wakes up a little bit, but the locket starts playing the amazing Davy Jones theme on, the little keys, but this lulls Jones back to sleep, and as he goes back to sleep, Will grabs the key and lets go of the tentacle. He switches the key out for the drawing of the key, and as soon as he is able to grab the key, he drops the tentacles back down and leaves Jones to sleep. Then we have one more shot of the locket playing the theme before it stops and closes, and then we go right back over to Bootstrap, who is beginning to lower a rowboat for Will to escape in. So Will, at this point, is ready to leave the Dutchman, and Bootstrap gives him his stuff back, and he also offers him his knife. So Bootstrap says, "Here, take this too," and he gives Will his knife. This is the knife that Will carries for the rest of this movie and at World's End. And then I love this scene between Will and Bootstrap here. It's fantastically paralleled in Pirates 5 at the very beginning of the movie with Will and Henry. But Bootstrap says, "Now get yourself to land and stay there. It was always in my blood to die at sea, but it was never a fate I'd wanted for you." And then Will looks at this knife and he says, "It's not a fate you had to choose for yourself either." And then Bootstrap says, "I could say what I had to when I led you to go pirating, but it would taste a lie to say it wasn't what I wanted. You owe me nothing, Will." Then Will says, "They'll know you helped me." And then Bootstrap laughs and he's like, "What more can they do to me?" And then Will holds up the knife and he says this, "I take this with a promise. I will find a way to sever Jones's hold on you and not rest until this blade pierces his heart. I will not abandon you. I promise." And then Will makes his escape into the boat and leaves the Flying Dutchman. And then in our next scene, we go back over to the next day on the Black Pearl. But I think this is a good stopping point for us to stop at. Because maybe I should stop myself here because at the end of this scene, we have something else that happens, which is very big. And so we'll stop here and we'll finish this. We'll not finish it in the next part, but we covered a half an hour here in 65 minutes, which isn't too bad. So we're probably still we have a whole hour left of the film, So we're probably going to have 2 more episodes for Dead Man's Chest. I don't want to make these episodes really long. They're already longer than the Curse of the Black Pearl episodes. They're all over an hour. I just don't want to do another 90-minute episode. I think it was a little too long. So I'll stay at a little over an hour. But if you enjoyed this episode, I thank you for listening. Thank you for getting this far. And if you're enjoying this podcast, make sure to give it a follow. Make sure to give it a rating on Spotify, a review on Apple Podcasts. I think there's a pretty good audience here so far, and I'm really thankful that you guys have found this podcast, are listening to it, and hopefully enjoying it. Because I am really enjoying sharing my love of Pirates of the Caribbean to all of you. So I thank you for listening once again, and I'll see you next week for the next part of Dead Man's Chest, which is a very, very juicy episode because we have the Kraken to cover, we have Ila Cruces, a lot of really fun stuff to cover in the next episodes, to make sure you get ready for next week's episode. So yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Podcast of the Caribbean is in no way affiliated with Disney. If you want to send me an email, you can send it over to podcastofthecaribbean@gmail.com. You can also follow this podcast on Twitter at podcastpotc, or you can follow on Instagram at Podcast of the Caribbean. I've posted some fun trivia and stuff over there, so make sure you give it a follow. And as always, keep a weather eye on the horizon, and dead men tell no tales.